G'day, welcome to part 7 of my unpacking of Richard Flanagan's book Toxic. I said at the beginning that I'd do one video per chapter, so really there should be 2 more to come. But my circumstances have changed, as I'll explain at the end, so this will be the last instalment. Apologies if it's a bit long. We begin this episode with a look back at the history of the Tasmanian salmon industry and how it intertwines with my own. In 1967, my parents bought this house behind us. My dad had left his job as a teacher and had picked up a job with his true calling as a marine biologist, as a fisheries scientist at an operation a mere 10 minutes walk from here. And this became my playground and my learning ground. We'd race our billy carts down the hill behind, all the way down till the cul-de-sac and the little track that led ultimately to the far south. We'd roll our billy carts down this dirt track until we've got to the Derwent River and the beautiful majestic waterway that you'll see in just a moment. And here it is, the Derwent estuary. And some days I'd follow this track even further and go around and visit my dad after school at his workplace. When we got to here, we knew we were halfway, a place that we affectionately called the Stink Works. And although it's been vastly improved now, still doesn't half pong. We'd finally made it. This was the Sea Fisheries Laboratories, and my dad was the first dedicated marine scientist employed by the state of Tasmania. Initially his research was on scallops, but later there were rock lobster and a range of other species. The entrance is around the front now, so there's no access from this gate, but up here was where all the science for marine science and aquaculture in Tasmania started. Dad left the Fisheries Laboratories in the late 70s when he was promoted to a position in Hobart to take on the role of fisheries management for the entire state. His position as chief scientist was replaced by the amazing Dr. Trevor Dix. The building behind us is now a luxury hotel, but in the early 1980s it was the headquarters of the Tasmanian Fisheries Development Authority, and in the office on the top floor sat my father, planning the implementation of a brand new aquaculture industry for Tasmania, farmed Atlantic salmon. In late 1976 we moved from over there to over here on the other side of the Derwent River. I was still at school at the time, and by the early 80s, however, I was working in my first job, but still scumming off my parents and living at home. And then, out of the blue, suddenly we get these visitors for dinner. And sitting around the dinner table, these guys with sort of strange European accents. I finally found out that they were Norwegians. And they were over here having discussions with my dad, who by this stage was in a senior management position with the Fisheries Department, Tasmanian Fisheries Development Authority. And these guys were talking about something really new called salmon farming. But that didn't really interest me. I was much more interested in some of the other things they were talking about. For example, one of them was Herman Witzinger, who was on the Kontiki raft. And it was far more exciting to hear about him catching sharks by the tail and flinging them onto the raft than about salmon swimming around and being fed. So from here grew the Tasmanian salmon industry. Dr. Dix and his amazing team hatched out the first Atlantic salmon from eggs in Tasmania for over 150 years. The eggs came from the Gaydon hatchery in New South Wales, up in the highlands near Jindabyne, and originally descended from 35 Atlantic salmon broodstock that were brought over from Nova Scotia in the 1960s. So from this building behind us, the practical operation of the Tasmanian aquaculture industry originated. This is the new entrance to the Sea Fisheries Laboratory at Taroona. although now it's known as the Institute for Marine and Antarctic Studies, a collaboration between the University of Tasmania and the state government of Tasmania. And in these buildings here gather the highest concentration of aquaculture and marine scientists in Australia, possibly in the Southern Hemisphere. But did Richard Flanagan consult any one piece of work from the thousands of research articles done by these research scientists in his book Toxic? Of course not, because he does not want to know the truth. Richard Flanagan sees some sort of conspiracy in that the headquarters of the Tassal Group are conveniently located in the same building as the marine farming branch of the Department of Primary Industry, Water and Environment. But for someone who's got a Master of History from Oxford, perhaps he could have done a little bit of research. The brown building behind us is the Marine Board building of Hobart. It was opened in 1972, and one of the first tenants was the Department of Agriculture, which later merged into the Department of Primary Industry, and today the Department of Primary Industry, Water and Environment. One of the first tenants in the Department of Agriculture was in fact my grandfather, Len Miller, who was the head of that department. In the late 1980s, the Tasmanian Fisheries Development Authority was converted into the Department of Sea Fisheries and moved from its offices on Old Wharf into the Marine Board building behind us. My father's office was in this building. Today, the Marine Farm branch is still in this building, and so, as a new tenant, is the Tassal Group. No conspiracy, just a matter of history. So, remember that my father was the senior Tasmanian government employee who was charged with establishing the salmon industry back in the 1980s? Well, considering that, this passage from chapter 7 is very interesting indeed. According to a former senior Tasmanian public servant who was asked to remain anonymous, in an account confirmed by a second source, the Norwegian consultants who helped establish the industry in the mid-1980s advised the Tasmanian government that other than in one or two experimental pens, salmon farming could never be allowed in the D'Entrecasteaux Channel. Now, I have no idea who this former senior Tasmanian public servant is, but I know who he's not. And unfortunately, my father is not in good enough health to be interviewed on camera. But according to him, Richard's claim is simply not true. There never was such advice given by the Norwegian consultants. In fact, those consultants formed a joint venture company with a Tasmanian operator and established the salmon farming company known as Nortas. And where did Nortas farm? Well, according to this history of the Tasmanian aquaculture industry, published by the University of Tasmania, Nortas farmed their fish at Bruny Island in the D'Entrecasteaux Channel. So it's hardly likely that this mysterious person is accurate by saying the Norwegians said to never farm in the D'Entrecasteaux Channel. And how do we know that this history is accurate? Well, that's because it was written by the person who led the Tasmanian Fisheries Development Authority to establish the salmon farming industry in the first place, that being Tony Harrison. So in the 270 references in the back of the book, Richard does not cite one piece of research from IMAS scientists. His associates have accused IMAS of being bought by industry and biased. On page 156, he says that, quote, more scientists and communities point to everything that is wrong with the salmon industry, end quote. So who are these scientists? In chapter 8, Richard refers to a consultation with one of these supposed independent scientists, Professor Graham Edgar, who, quote, believes that the channel ecosystem is very badly degraded, end quote. Richard doesn't cite the source of this statement. In fact, he doesn't cite any one of Professor Edgar's 228 research papers. Of those 228 papers, only 4 address salmon farming, and only 3 relate to the effects of salmon farming. The most recent was published in 2018 and explores algal growth on marinas. The stormwater drains and fish farm cages from urban, that is land-based sources of pollution. Another in the same year broadens the source of nutrients to include those from fish farming. And a paper in 2015 explored impacts from fish farming on macroalgal growth with varying and inconsistent results. And finally, one in 2010 explores the use of biotic and abiotic indicators for broad-scale environmental monitoring. That includes those Dorvalade worms we were explored in part 2. Compare Professor Edgar's research output on salmon farming with that of Associate Professor Katrina McLeod, who has 21 research papers on the impact of salmon farming and more than 20 years' experience working with research in aquaculture. So why would Richard not consult with Associate Professor McLeod? That's probably because she works for the evil IMAS, biased and in the pocket of industry.
So the first attempts to introduce salmon to Australia were back in the 1860s, but they weren't terribly successful.
Okay, so Associate Professor McLeod is biased and Professor Edgar is independent. So where does this independent scientist work? That's right, IMAS. Is IMAS biased? I don't think so. So enough about the science, let's look at the reality. We've already seen how the waterways near Richard's former shack on Bruny Island are nothing like the devastated waste ground he describes in the book. So let's look at some work by some of his key collaborators. This extract from the video Paradise Lost by Justin Kurzel and Connor Castles-Lynch purports to show the impact of salmon farming on rocky reefs near Huon Island, which is in the distance.
The biggest shock obviously was Huon Island, which was crystal clear. For years I dived it, and then in the last dive I just couldn't believe what happened down there. I was just flabbergasted. All water plants, kelp or anything what grows in the water and the rocks, they have all this sort of that much sort of brownish looking dust, looks like dust.
Yet this extract from the 2021 SBS TV show Malaysia in Australia shows Adam Liao diving in exactly the same waters with vastly different results.
Robert, what's this place?
This place is called Huon Island.
What are we here for?
We're going to get the black-lipped, abalone and also the sea urchin.
Diving for sea urchin is something that's second nature to Robert, and I try gamely to keep up. As an ingredient, sea urchin is one of the most prized and most expensive seafood items in Asia, fetching up to 1,500 Malaysian ringgit, approximately 500 Aussie dollars, per kilo.
And this episode, from another SBS show, A Girl's Guide to Hunting, Fishing and Wild Cooking, shows Chef Annalise Gregory diving for scallops in the Don Jacinto Channel.
And as soon as I'm in the water, all my concerns float away. I'm a spellbound visitor in an enchanted world. Mikey's secret spot is certainly paying off. I don't see any sharks, and there's more scallops than I...
Again, it seems that the waters are not devastated nor covered with dust, as Flanagan's cohort claims. I'll leave you to make up your mind. Or better still, come and have a dive in these waters yourself. So, what other fiction do the contributors to Richard's book write about the state of our beaches and waterways? On page 162, he quotes one as saying, "The beautiful white sands turn grey. Things have become a disaster. The beaches are blackish sludge. The top of the water is putrid with this sludge stinking." Well, the very first salmon farm in Tasmania was in this bay, and it's been continually farmed here for 38 years, the largest concentration of salmon farms in any place in Tasmania. And look at the sand, and look at the water. I don't think so. On page 164, he quotes Susan Westcott from Big Roaring Beach off the Tasmanian Peninsula. Just an aside, Richard, Susan lives here at Big Roaring Beach, just out of Dover, in the far south. Not the Tasman Peninsula, let alone the Tasmanian Peninsula, as there's no such place. Susan writes, "The fish farms are creating dirty water, not fit for me to swim in off Big Roaring Beach." Well, Does this look like a devastated waterway landscape to you? I don't think so. In Chapter 8, Richard extols the virtues of land-based fish farming as the solution to the future. In particular, he sings the praises of Atlantic Sapphire, quote, "A Norwegian company, the share price of which has risen by 280% between 2017 and 2020, and in 2021 is midways through building a massive land-based facility costing $400 million US, which already produces 9,000 tonnes of salmon annually and will in 10 years produce 220,000 tonnes." End quote. Now, this sounds great, but the reality for Atlantic Sapphire is not quite as rosy as Richard would have us believe. Atlantic Sapphire, when will it break even? Atlantic Sapphire continues to struggle. Atlantic Sapphire report all fish lost after fire. Atlantic Sapphire crash worsens. We are in an unprecedented situation. Atlantic Sapphire's aquaculture woes is a cautionary tale. Early sexual maturity is the latest retreat of Atlantic Sapphire, a land-based salmon farming. But why the move to land-based salmon farming in the Northern Hemisphere? Flanagan and activists would like us to believe that it's to protect the environment from the fish. But the reality is the other way round. Land-based salmon farming protects the fish from the environment, particularly from sea lice, which costs the Norwegian industry 5 billion kroner, or about 800 million Australian dollars per year. We don't have sea lice in Tasmania, so the need for land-based farming is less. But Richard's modus operandi is not for us to believe the truth about land-based salmon farming, nor for us to believe that he really wants land-based farming to take off. In Chapter 8, he praises Huon Aquaculture's land-based operation at Whale Point and Tassale's new hatchery at Meadowbank as a step in the right direction. In this, he doesn't hide his hypocrisy, because in Chapter 6, he spent a large amount of effort attacking Tassale's Meadowbank hatchery. Because Flanagan and his ilk don't really want land-based salmon farming, they don't want any salmon farming at all. And if you don't believe that they'll start protesting against it as soon as it's mooted, then all we have to do is look what's happening overseas. Animal activists protesting against Atlantic Sapphire for animal cruelty. Protesters against a land-based farm proposed for Belfast in Maine. Because this is the reality. As we move towards land-based farming, the protesters will move towards protesting against land-based farming. An argument used to promote the salmon industry is that it provides employment, so of course the activists have to attack that premise. Richard quotes Tassale as saying that it's one of Tasmania's largest employers, but then tries to prove that it's not. Richard states that the salmon industry employs only 1,600 people, while Tasmania's largest employer, the Federal Group, employs more than 2,000. That's comparing apples with oranges, industry with an employer. Richard gets his figure from this report by the Australia Institute, written by Leanne Minshall, a known anti-salmon farming activist. Her report does say on page 8 that the salmon industry employs 1,500, Richard can't get that number right, but on the very next page states that Tassale employs 1,261, Huon 659, and Petuna 264, a total of 2,184. In Tasmania, an employer that has over 1,000 employees is a very large employer indeed. And if you break it down regionally, the salmon industry is the largest private sector employer in the Huon Valley. In addition to direct employment, there is flow-on employment, like my own job, for example, but also net and pen construction, business feed companies, engineering companies, transport, etc. This report by the FRDC and BDO Consulting shows that the number of indirect jobs supported by the aquaculture industry is just under 5,000. Finally, Richard tries to convince the reader that the industry is actually shedding jobs due to advances in technology and innovation. While this is incorrect, While technical advances like remote feeding are replacing on-site feeding, there are still people feeding fish. And if the companies are shedding jobs, then why have they got so many jobs available on their website? So again, Richard's facts just do not add up. And what makes me particularly angry is Richard's reference to a submission made by the Huon Valley Council to the Legislative Council Finfish Inquiry, which said, among other things, less educated locals struggled to get jobs with aquaculture companies because they lacked the skills. That submission was later withdrawn, allegedly under pressure from the Huon Aquaculture Company. Why was the submission withdrawn? Because it was simply wrong. My educational program alone has put 80 young people into jobs in aquaculture. 80 employment opportunities for young people in a depressed regional area where opportunities are scarce. 80 young people into the industry with the highest level of people with Certificate 3 and higher qualifications than any industry in Tasmania. Richard, on the back of his book, says, "Is Tasmanian salmon one big lie?" No, it's not, but this book is. And now, after 6 generations, I'm leaving Tasmania to take up an aquaculture job on the mainland. I was going to entitle this video "The Narrow Billy Cart Track to the Far South," as this is my spiritual home. But now I'm heading north, so maybe this is a better title. Thanks for watching.